All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to take your seats again, please. Thank you again to all of you for joining us here this morning. We now move to our final session of the conference, which will be the keynote speech from the man that I decided in my head just now to call ACKC MP, which is obviously Alex Chalk, the Secretary of State for Justice and Lord Chancellor. So without further ado, please do welcome Alex.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much. Thank you, Angus. And it's really good to see you all. I'm conscious that I've spoken to some of the people who've been doing the panel a few moments ago, and I know we've got some real legal expertise in the room. So it's a delight to have you here. Thank you very much for doing so. Look, I was going to start by saying a little bit of background about me and my legal background, because that informs the context for what I want to say. So before I came into politics, I was a barrister. I was a barrister for about 14, 15 years. I started off doing commercial law, shipping and so on. I then went into clinical negligence, law of costs, and then went into crime. As a criminal barrister, I did everything from starting in the magistrate's court through to doing a serious fraud. I did a lot of work for the SFO, the Financial Conduct Authority, homicide, so murder, manslaughter, death by dangerous driving, a lot of terrorism cases. I prosecuted a number of people who were associates of someone called Anjem Chowdhury, who we remember for Al-Muhajirun, prosecuted people who were out in the east of London, the so-called Muslim patrol cases, prosecuted bomb plots, but I also defended as well. So I defended people accused of serious crimes, ranging from, assault through to ones that are even more serious than that. And so that's helped to provide some element of perspective that when I hear certain suggestions in the House of Commons, so for example, Labour's current obsession with wanting to water down or even remove accessory liability, so-called joint enterprise, I've lived and breathed these principles as a practitioner, and I understand in terms of the impact on the front line of what that would actually mean for crime and justice in our country. And so when I was appointed to this role, what happens, incidentally, if any of you become a Secretary of State in the fullness of time, you'll sit down with your civil servants and they will say, what are your priorities? And I said that my priorities are to ensure that we convict the guilty, acquit the innocent, and ensure the public are protected. And it was considered, I think, a little quaint to say, well, why do you talk about acquit the innocent? And I said, I tell you what, the British people are fair-minded people. And you can start by thinking that it's all about hanging and flogging and making sure the bad guys go to prison. And by the way, that's an incredibly important part of it. But it's also important that we have a fair system that ensures that if people are wrongly accused, that they have the opportunity to secure their acquittal and to leave a courtroom with no stain on their character. And if we were in any doubt about that, then the experience of the Horizon scandal shows that that fundamental belief in justice runs like a stick of rock through the British people. And the other thing I just want to say by way of context, we don't talk about it much. There is a sort of cultural diffidence in our country. But I think it's reasonable to observe that no other country has contributed as much as we have to the international rules-based order. And another part of context, which will inform some of the points that I make in a moment, is which is the country which has not just the largest legal sector in Western Europe, in fact, not just the largest legal sector in the whole of Europe. The one which has the second largest legal sector in the whole world is the United Kingdom, more specifically England and Wales. And this is something which is poorly understood, but it's a matter of pride in its own right. But even more importantly than that, it's a matter that is fundamental to our success and prosperity as a nation. It brings us over £30 billion a year in revenue, but also this. If any of you have come across people, as you will have done in your life, people of talent, of ability, but you might not necessarily have had the easiest start in life, well, one of the great engines of social mobility, one of the great opportunities that our country can provide is through the legal sector. I'll just give you one very, very small anecdote. Before I came into politics, I used to go with my wig and gown to inner London schools. I was brought up in Cheltenham, but I spent time here as a barrister in inner London schools, and I'd go with my wig and gown into deprived schools, and I'd say, well, look, why don't we set up a mock trial? Why don't we give this a go? And we're going to come up with a set of circumstances, a theft of a mobile phone. And I would give people an opportunity to examine in chief and to cross-examine. And I came across some people of extraordinary ability. And I think, in some ways, the proudest moment of my life was, again, long before I came into politics. I went along, did one of these things, and I said to this kid who'd shown particular promise, come with me to the Old Bailey. Come and watch a murder trial take place. And he came and thought nothing more of it. And then a few years later, I heard that he'd won a place at Cambridge to read law. And I don't know what's happening to him now, but I suspect he's a plutocrat. But so long as he's paying his taxes, I don't care. That's absolutely fantastic. Anyway, listen, so those are just some opening remarks which give a sense, hopefully, of the perspective to which I come to this incredibly important role. I'm also going to be very candid with you about things, when we look at the long perspective of the last 14 years, there are things that we could have done differently, and there are things that, with the benefit of hindsight, I think I might have changed. But we should never allow the current challenges, which do exist, and again, I'll be frank with you, to obscure. There have been some enormous changes over the last 14 years, some enormous improvements, which I think are dramatically for the better and set our country on the right path, such that if we stay the course, we can recover parts of the system that have been badly affected by the pandemic, and we can continue to deliver the justice that our country expects and deserves. So I think it's important to look, in terms of that context, of some of the really important things that have changed. First, Act 1, Scene 1. Since 2010, crime is down. Crime is down. Proven reoffending, overall crime has fallen by 55%, particularly violent crime, burglary, neighborhood crime. So, of course, true it is that there have been concerns about online fraud, and we can come to that specifically. But overall, crime is down. And that means fewer people suffering the appalling experience of being a victim, having their lives shattered, having trust betrayed, and having their futures curtailed. Second, Act 1, Scene 2, proven reoffending is down from 31% to 25%. That's important in its own right, because proven reoffending in pounds, shillings, and pence means that the cost to the economy, something like £18 billion a year in reoffending, drops significantly. Every single time you bring it down a percentage point, it has that impact. And of course, it means fewer people suffering the misery that I referred to a few moments ago. What about how we've approached this issue of sentencing? So that's crime. What about punishment? Well, to govern is to choose. We choose to ensure that, as part of protecting the public, those who are able to cause the most harm should be kept out of circulation for longer. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we think we should move to a situation where for lower level, lower risk offences, it's a constant ratchet of banging people up for longer. But where they are the most serious crimes, we do make no apology for making that decision. So that means that, for example, the overall average sentence for rape having gone up by around 50%. Overall sentences are up as well. But it also means, compared to the situation that I had to encounter as a practitioner, that there is far more probity, it seems to me, in the sentencing system. Let me just give you one example. So when I was in practice in, say, 2008, 2009, you'd prosecute a very serious rape, which I did on many occasions. Stand up, please, Joe Bloggs. The crime you've committed is extremely serious. You've destroyed this woman's life. I see to it, as far as discharging justice in this case, you will receive a sentence of 10 years imprisonment. Now, what, of course, the press reporting on it might not have been entirely aware of, is that guy would get out automatically at the halfway point. And if you want to know where that came from, it came from Section 244 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003, which in turn reversed the law that we had introduced, which is that if you got over 4 years, you'd serve 2/3. That got changed by the Labour government. And to my mind, that introduced a fundamental dishonesty into sentencing. So we reversed that, and we have changed it. And that's important, and we will go further still in the sentencing bill to ensure that those who commit the most serious offences will spend a higher proportion of that sentence behind bars. It's also reasonable, it seems to us, that there should be whole life orders for those who commit the most appalling crimes, namely murder in the context of sexual or sadistic conduct. But I'll come to the future a bit in a moment. So far I've talked about crime down and punishment up. So let me turn to this issue of prisons. Well, look, the first thing to be aware of is, again, back in 2008, 2009, as a practitioner, when there were strains in the custodial estate, in fact, significant strains, the response from the then Home Secretary was, don't worry, we're going to build 3 Titan prisons. The number actually built, 0. And so we said, this Prime Minister, as Chancellor, funded the largest prison expansion since the Victorian era. Now, of course, you might say, well, that's easy to say, but has it actually been delivered? Damn right it's been delivered. It's been delivered in HMP 5 Wells, HMP Fossway, 2 big prisons, each of them about 1,600. And I tell you this, if you go to see those prisons, again, coming back to the point, what are the instincts of the British people? British people want to see an austere but decent and rehabilitative environment. That is what you have got. And I want you to picture the scene if you can. You go into these prisons, safe, clean, and decent, workshops where people have areas where they can learn how to do joinery or bricklaying. And I spoke to one of the guys providing the training in there, and I said, you provide this training on the inside and on the outside. How do they differ? And he said to me, do you know what? The guys in here are more motivated. They want to turn their lives around. They want to take this opportunity. Or I could talk to you about when I went to 5 Wells, and there actually was an optometry workshop where they were creating the spectacles, creating the prescription glasses for the entire estate. And guess what? The number of people employed, the proportion of offenders who'd done that course who were employed on the outside, something like 90%. So we've already rolled out 5,800 prison places, and those are safe, decent, modern rehabilitative places. What we're also doing is looking to invest in other prisons to expand their estate and to expand decency. Recently, I don't know if any of you read The Telegraph, maybe one or two in here, I went to HMP Liverpool at the end of last week, and I said that prisons as well as prisoners can be redeemed. Because I sat on the Justice Select Committee in 2017, and we had to gulp our way through the most dreadful report that came out from HMIP, candidly. It was not good. It's not what we would expect in our country. There was talk of rats and cockroaches, and it was just something that was frankly a source of shame. And what have we done? We haven't sought to sweep it under the carpet. We've dealt with it as British politicians should, which is to say, that's not good. We are going to address it, and that's exactly what we've done. So we've invested in the prison. I've seen it for myself, and to cut a long story short, by 2022, HMIP went round, and it was a story of redemption. I went round, and should I tell you the thing when I was on these wings? Do you know the most significant thing was the sound of silence? Even though this was a full wing, but it was calm, it was quiet, it was orderly, and it was decent. Not just that, but we're also bringing on 300 places as well. So of course there's a narrative about some difficulties we have in certain prisons. But by the way, which is the party that actually introduced the urgent notification measure, that wanted transparency when things go wrong? It was us. So we have over 100 prisons, and there are some which have got problems, HMP, Bedford, and so on, but there is a laser-like focus on turning them around, and there is a lot of investment in rolling out the largest prison building program since the Victorian era. As I say, 5,800 places, more to go. But what we've also done is rolled out £100 million of security. So that means that there's body-worn videos, that means there's airport-style security, that means that the staff that I spoke to feel safe and supported, and that we have confidence in them, and we look to back them. As I say, it's also about rehabilitation as well. One, I think, of the most moving meetings that I've had in this job is sitting down and speaking to guys who work in industry as part of these employment advisory boards. Now, these are people who could just be saying, do you know what, I'm just going to run my own business and get on, do my life, pay my taxes, and just be done. And yet, these are people who take an interest in society and the world around them. They sit on these employment advisory boards, and these boards are affiliated to specific prisons. And instead of just leaving it to the state to say, well, do you mind just doing a bit of bit of training and hopefully these guys will get a job on the outside. It's far more sophisticated than that. So they engage with each prison and they say, right, when folks come out of that nick, what kinds of jobs are going to be available in that community? Now, let's see if we can tailor the training to those jobs. So it might be, for example, there's a whole load of hospitality that he's doing. It might be that there's construction. It might be that Network Rail need people to go and work on the railway or whatever. And they help, working with something called New Futures Network, to actually do that. So that's the Timpsons of this world. That's Greg's. That's so many other organizations that are doing that. Or I could talk about Clink's Kitchens, where people are learning City and Guilds qualifications so that they can work in that hospitality sector on the outside. And again, this isn't just sort of, oh, well, let's hit and hope. Let's give it a go, and with a bit of luck, it'll be all right on the night. Let's look at what has happened in the data. And in the year up to March 2023, the proportion of offenders in employment 6 months post-release had doubled. And we know, don't we, that key drivers of ensuring people stay on the straight and narrow, if people have that sense of hope and wanting to turn their lives around, is if they get into employment. Because hope is about saying, not I'm an irretrievably bad man, they may have done an irretrievably bad thing, but that I'm somebody who can see past that and to develop some stake in the society around them. That's not to say we don't want to punish them. Yes, we do want to punish them, but we also want to rehabilitate them as well. And so that's why we've had drug recovery, substance-free living units. There are training opportunities in prisons. And I actually was in 5 Wales, and they were sitting with the guys using AI. So they sit in a machine which teaches them how to use everything from a forklift to a front loader to all these devices. That's using technology in prison. Final thing I want to say about that as well is that we're using technology in prisons to address the other aspect which is critical to rehabilitation, which of course is substance abuse. You will understand fine well that a lot of the folks who end up in jail are people who've got addictions as well as neurodiversity. You know, we've got that screening going on the way in. I think Robert Buckland will probably have talked a bit about that. But here's the important thing. What you don't want is when they come out, suddenly not to have the substance treatment that they had on the inside. So how do you cross that divide? Answer, use technology. So a number of prisons use in-cell technology to ensure that they can be getting the treatment from the very people on the outside that will go on to provide that continuity of care on their release. That is critically important. So when you combine that with the fact that we're going to be rolling out prisoner passports with their national insurance number, etc., when you see that we've got the employment advisory boards providing these job opportunities, when you see that someone like HMP Berwyn, when you go to their employment hub, it looks like a job center. You can see that that person can have an interview in a video suite with their employers from inside. When you combine those things, that is why the statistics have improved on employability. It hasn't happened by accident, but by very, very hard work. So I think one of the things that I see as my job as Lord Chancellor is not to say, oh, do you know what, it's motherhood and apple pie, we've got no problems, we've got no pressures. We do, and I'm going to come on to some of those. But a proper balanced context is that there is some exceptional rehabilitative work going on in our country. And don't take that from me. I was in the States recently speaking to guys in New York, and they look at some of what we do in England and Wales as a beacon and as a model of how to do it. So that's an important part. I wanted to talk about punishment in the community. We've got to get real as a country about this. It costs £47,000 a year to keep someone in bed and breakfast in custody. It's an extremely expensive option, and it's absolutely the right option for those most dangerous people. For lower level offenders, tech provides opportunities that were not there in 2010. So when I was prosecuting in 2010, and you came to do a community sentence, the judge was sitting there thinking, right, okay, what can I do? Well, you can have an unpaid work order, which is going to have to be supervised entirely by probation, and I'm going to put you on a tag, but of course that tag was likely to be a radio frequency tag. All the radio frequency tag could do is say, has this guy kept to his curfew or is he on the run? But if he hadn't kept the curfew, that was it, you didn't know where he's gone. Who knows? He's gone. No idea. And of course that means that benches would find it difficult to have confidence in those tags. So what's happened since? Well, we've rolled out these GPS tags. You know what a GPS does, of course, you've got it all on your phone. But that's incredibly significant because it shows a person, right, this is the area you're not allowed to go into. And I tell you, that physical weight on your ankle, you may have seen that I actually had one. It's not just a physical reminder of the fact that you need to repay your debt to society, take your medicine, repay your debt, but it's also, here are the barriers, here are the boundaries, literally don't cross the boundaries. And because the tech is so good, you as that individual who's been tagged know fine well you're going to get caught. There's no question. It's not a question, well, will I or won't I? There's no jeopardy to it. You will get caught. And that means you risk the clang of the prison gate. And behaviorally, we know this stuff works. So we've got alcohol tags. These are unbelievably sophisticated tags. So even though people, of course, try to game it, and it's disgusting, really, some of them try to put chicken skin between the sensor and the tag to try to fool it. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it's very sophisticated at establishing whether you've been drinking. Now, guess what? As a result, the compliance is very high. So for every, it's 97% compliance. So that's quite a thing. And what that means is that in those marginal cases, the judge can say with much more confidence, right, I want you to be punished for what you've done, so you will do an unpaid work order. You will clean up graffiti, you will do this. And by the way, we will know whether you're on your way to attend that hearing because we put a tag on you. You will have your liberty restricted on the weekends because I don't see why you should be able to go and enjoy time in the pub, which is why we're going to give you a 16-hour curfew, so it's a pandemic-style curfew, or maybe even a 20-hour curfew, which we've extended to do on one of the nights. That's what we're going to do. We're also going to say, because alcohol was at the heart of your offending, you went out and whacked someone in Cheltenham High Street queue, which you should not have done. But actually, do you know what? When you are sober, you are a contributing member of society. But when you get on the sauce, you're a menace. We're going to put an alcohol tag on you. And so we are going to restrict and we are going to deal with the source of your offending. So you will be punished, you'll be rehabilitated, and we have options now that we did not have 15 years ago. It would be mad not to use those. Other countries are. We need to be at the forefront of technology in ensuring that we don't inflict a double whack on the taxpayer. First, being a victim of crime in the first place, but second, being forced to pay for the cost of keeping this person out of a law-abiding life. So here's the final thing, is there was a very interesting article in the Eye recently following closely people on these tags and doing this community work. And do you know what they said? This guy said, he said, time and time again, the supervisor said, offenders will say to me, it's much easier for me to be in prison. This is harder. What you are asking me to do in the community is harder. So we need to get away from this mindset of saying, oh, well, it's a touch. You've had a touch because you're on a community order. Absolutely not. And the critical point is technology allows us to make them robust, rehabilitative, and frankly, punitive. And we should not shy away from that. Right, let me talk about something which is really, really important. Violence against women and girls. I want this, if you remember one thing from this talk, I hope you'll remember this. Compared to 2010, the landscape in terms of how we address violence against women and girls is night and day. There has been an extraordinary transformation, and I'm just going to illustrate it in what was standard operating procedure when I was a barrister. Right, so say in the magistrate's court where I started my career, allegation of common assault. Allegation is that man hits woman, the girlfriend at home. Now, you'd be turning up on a Monday morning, listed for trial. I've got the statement, I've got the case summary, I've got the Police National Computer Report. This guy's got a bit of form for thuggery, a bit of Public Order Act offences, a common assault, and ABH is on there as well. Listed for trial at Hemel Hempstead Magistrates Court. And you're listed for 10 o'clock. It's 9:45. Do you know what? The police officer's here. But where is she? She hasn't turned up. She hasn't turned up. It's getting really close now. You get to 10 o'clock. Your case is listed on the bench. So are you ready to trial? Ready to proceed? I'm not ready to proceed, sir, madam. Can I have 10 minutes? The officer in the case is going to make some inquiries. Okay? You have 10 minutes, but I want to start at 10 past 10. 10 minutes. You're speaking to the officer in the case. Call her. You've got to get her here. What's going on? It's just ringing out, sir. Just can't get through to her. Go into court. I'm so sorry, sir. I'm going to have to offer no evidence in this case. She hasn't turned up. She's not cooperating with the prosecution. And that was it. And that's effectively what would happen. We now understand that that's not the way to deal with it because she may well have not wanted to, felt scared, been got at. So what do we do now? First of all, in terms of the proposal, it's massively different. We offer a package of support that says stuff like, in our victims code, which we've rebooted and revamped, you can have a court familiarization visits. You get supported by the CPS if they're thinking about changing charges. You can make a victim personal statement to tell the court about how things have been affected. If someone doesn't want to attend, the officer will inquire, well, why is that? Maybe we could get special measures so you give your evidence behind the screen or over a live link. Maybe even we'll have to do the tough love thing of a witness summons to come to court. So you have to say, look, it wasn't me, Mr. Abusive ex-partner. The prosecution required me to come to court to give this evidence. They're the bad guys, not you. That's massively important. That is a night and day change. But we've also created offences that did not exist. It wasn't a crime to stalk someone in 2010. It was not a crime to have coercive and controlling behavior, the kind of non-physical abuse which shatters women's lives, which makes them feel that they are living in this endless nightmare of persecution. We're the ones who've changed that. We created an offence of non-fatal strangulation. Now, you could prosecute it under another heading, but it was never possible to specifically identify this kind of behavior. Created a new aggravating factor for domestic abusers who kill their partners through degrading sexual behavior, upskirting. As I said, the new Victims Court campaign. In family courts, we ended the ordeal of domestic abusers being able to cross-examine their victims. We quadrupled victims' funding. We ensured that people can give their evidence via Section 28 to pre-record it so they can move on with their lives as opposed to having to wait for a case to come to trial. All this we do and more because we recognize that to protect women and girls is a core mission, and we're not done yet. So that's the context. I said I'd come to the challenges, and challenges there are. You will have read in the papers that there are issues about prisons and courts. Of course there are. But I want to just put some perspective, which I think has not been properly referred to in some of the narrative on all this. During the pandemic, I was a junior minister. Robert Buckland, who I think you heard from before, was the Secretary of State. And we were faced in the white heat of that pandemic with two very, very big judgment calls. And the first judgment call was whether to let out some prisoners. And by the way, not just a few prisoners. The strong recommendation was to let out a bare minimum of 16,000 prisoners. And actually, if you work through the logic of what the recommendation was, considerably more than that, probably closer to 25,000. Now, before you think that that was some weird, rogue suggestion, just have a look at other nations of the world. Well, I went to the United States, as I indicated, and there, whether it's from the Supreme Court all the way to a frontline judge, they said, well, yeah, we let out tens of thousands. And if you want a specific statistic, look at California, which is a state which has a smaller population than ours, but not wildly different. They let out 11,000. Go to France, where again I raised it with them, they let out closer to 13,000. So that was principled issue number one. We didn't do that, and by the way, the judgment was right, because it was predicated upon assumption that the virus would run riot through prisons and that you would have thousands and thousands of deaths. And so in fact the proposal was to prioritize prisoner safety over wider public safety. That was the devil's own dilemma. And we resolved it by saying, actually, there should be 200 released of the most vulnerable, but not 16,000, certainly not 25,000. Now, so what is not being talked about is the fact that if those guys had come out, there would be people who have not been victims of crime, who were walking around living their lives, going back to their families, for whom it might have been different if that decision had been made. And that's a really important point that doesn't get written about. Point one. Point two, we had to make a decision about jury trials. Jury trials and pandemics go together like a fish and a bicycle. There's literally no system on God's green earth that is less well suited to a pandemic than jury trials. And that's because you have retirement rooms, you have to have, when the jury need to step out where you're having a legal argument, you need all the space. It's a nightmare. But were we going to be the country, were we going to be the government that after 1,000 years of British history, we should be ripping it up because a pandemic had come along? That would have been to snuff out the lamp of our liberty and take away a key and core fundamental building block of what it means to be free-born in this country. It would have been a terrible mistake to do that. But there is a price you pay for principle. So our job is to heal the system and to build back from it. And that we are doing. That's why we've kept the Nightingale courts open. That's why we've invested up to £141 million more into legal aid to try to recruit more lawyers. That's why we're recruiting 1,000 judges. Section 28 I talked about, the rape support helpline to support people through the process. It doesn't mean that there aren't pressures. There are pressures. But those who say, particularly if they launch political attacks, look at these problems, they have to ask themselves the question, well, what would you have done? And interestingly, if you would have done something different, why did you not mention it during the pandemic? Not a single thing. The only suggestion that came out of the opposition throughout the entire criminal justice system is, oh, well, you should go from having 12-man jury trials to 7-man, with everyone, every educated commentator saying, that makes no difference at all. That solves literally nothing. And indeed, I have not heard a single coherent suggestion. So it's simply carping without suggestions. There's a word for that, and it's just called moaning. So that's what I see from the Labour Party is, I'm afraid, no coherent or credible solution. So I said, listen, I'll bring this to an end, because the fun bit is when we talk and discuss. But we are not done. We have 4 bills in this parliamentary session. We're delivering for women and girls in the criminal justice bill. So we're criminalising taking intimate images. You might have seen the Georgia Harrison stuff, expanding the offence of encouraging or assisting self-harm. We're compelling defendants to attend sentencing hearings. That's the Lucy Letby stuff. It's perfectly reasonable to be robust on that. We can do it within the four corners of the law. The Victims and Prisoners Bill, sending a clear signal about what victims should expect. The Sentencing Bill, which I've talked about, which strikes the right balance between ensuring that those we're most scared of get locked up for longer, those we're most cross with, we're rehabilitating as well as punishing. The Arbitration Bill, bolstering the UK's thriving legal sector, and so on. And I know, incidentally, that if we are fortunate enough to win a further term, I'm absolutely clear about where we need to go. There are things that we need to do. We need to ensure that the system is streamlined with more drugs offences in the magistrates' court. We need to change the planning system for prisons, which is something which drives me completely mad. We need to ramp up ERS 18 to get more foreign national offenders out. We've taken some tough decisions. We need to make sure that the resource is there to get them out, and we need to support our legal sector to continue to thrive and grow. But we will do this, friends and colleagues, from a position of principle, a position which says that we are a nation that is given more to the international rules-based order than any other, a nation that has the fundamentals to prosper. And I think if we ally energy with our principles, I'm absolutely convinced that the future for justice in our country and the future for our country overall can be very bright indeed. Thank you.
Polite way of saying, was I too long?
No, it's a polite way of saying thank you for saving me a lot of questions, so I can keep my bit short, which I think is beneficial for everybody. And then we can take some questions from the audience as well. So do get those creative juices flowing as you think through them. You gave us a really kind of good scene setter on the work that you're doing in terms of crime and in terms of punishment and some of the challenges within the justice system. I, of course, wouldn't expect you to come here today and point to those challenges in a greater way than what you have. But do you understand that some people across the country might look at the justice system right now? You've got courts backlogged. I think it's almost 30% of Crown Court cases waiting more than a year for a hearing. You've got legal aid spending fallen by almost over 40%, I think, since 2011. 2/3 of prisons in England and Wales are classed as overcrowded. You've then got potentially, and I know this is under review, so I wouldn't expect you to comment on it, but the case of the Nottingham killer, Valdo Calcone, being reviewed for potentially being a lenient sentence. You've got injustices popping up in the form of, obviously, the Post Office Horizon scandal. There's lots of examples of people who are watching the news to think, is this system working for the people of this country? What do you say to them?
Right, I think you've raised so many issues there, and I think that the trouble is if we're not going to be speaking in slogans, but speaking in, not suggesting you are, but speaking in details, there are specific answers for specific things. So look, I'll just take a couple of points. On the issue of crowding, in fact, the level of crowding in prisons, which does exist, very candid about that, is at or around the same level it was in 2010. So the idea that it's got worse, that's not materially true. Second, the business about backlog. Don't forget that over 90% of all criminal cases are heard in the magistrate's court, and that is operating well. Yes, it has its pressures, but it is operating well. That is dealing with common assaults, non-domestic burglaries. That's dealing with everything from ABH to, as I say, acquisitive offending, shoplifting, some youth robberies and so on. So there's lots of work that is taking place in the magistrate's court and is happening extremely well. The third point is, you talk about some cases taking a year to come on in the Crown Court. Those most serious cases, I know from having prosecuted and defended, there are plenty that will need that time because you have to have disclosure take place. Experts have got to be instructed. That evidence has to be served. You then need to make further inquiries, disclosure requests and so on. So there's a huge amount which needs to take place. And when you look at the average between prosecution and sentence for a rape case, if you read all the media, you would assume it's like 5 years. The average is 1 year and 54 days. Now, of course, I'd like to bring that down, but it's important not to lose sight of that important fact. Now, you referred to Horizon. The Horizon thing is, horrendous. And the first thing that you're taught as a prosecutor, and I would say this when my kids would come around with, not kids, but pupil barristers coming around with me, and I'd tell them about what it means to be a prosecutor in England and Wales. I'd say, listen, you are here as a minister of justice. What that means is you're not there to get a conviction at all costs, but you have to be fair. And what that means in very simple terms in our jurisdiction is that if material comes into your possession, which, to cite the test, might reasonably be considered capable of undermining the case of the prosecution or assisting the case of the defence, you've got to disclose it. So in plain English, what that means is this. If you are accused of a crime, of a robbery, a street robbery, your defence is, it wasn't me. Yes, I was arrested, I didn't do it. You are a white male with a blue tie. I have 5 witnesses who say it was a white male with a blue tie that did it, fine, so that case. But then someone comes along, contacts the police and says, no, it wasn't a white. It was actually a black female with a green jumper. Now I could sit on that and say, George, that's not very convenient. Ooh, that's not really going to help my case. Well, perhaps I'll just hide that away. No, what I do is I provide it to you, I provide it to the defence. And what was so catastrophic in the Horizon case is when they saw that there was material which suggested that the system wasn't working, they sat on it. And that is not good. That is not good. I had stronger words, but now's not the moment.
I should say it wasn't me.
It wasn't you, yeah.
Well, the observer amongst you will notice that Ed Argyle was also wearing a blue tie with pink fingers on it, so I'm not pointing fingers. Your recent proposal to support foreign offenders rather than prosecuting them in the UK to alleviate overcrowded jails, how do you plan to balance that with ensuring that victims are getting the right justice?
So it's a balance, you know, and so much of life is about balance. So look, again, something that people, if you listen to everything you read, you might say, well, we don't deport any foreign national offenders. It's all a bit of a nightmare. Not true. We deport over 3,000 a year. It's really important. These are people you're sticking on planes, taking out of our country, and they can never come back. So there is a proper public interest in appropriate low-level cases to say, the option is we take this guy and we run him through the criminal justice system at huge cost to the taxpayer, potentially getting a community order at the end or kind of low level, or we can just get him out. Now, plainly, if it's a case of domestic abuse or it's rape or it's a really serious matter, he is going to have to be prosecuted here, convicted, punished and disgraced, and that's exactly the way it should be. But what do we do about someone who is a serial nuisance? This is a guy, public order matter, so he's swearing at police all the time, that he is somebody who, when he drinks, becomes a pain, and even if people aren't threatened by him, that there is a sort of public order dispute that's going on. He's been a petty thief at the local co-op. Now, we could charge him again, put him through the system, he hasn't got any money, he's living a pretty hopeless life, he's got a drug problem and so on, or we can just get him out. And I do think it's perfectly proper in certain cases to say, I just don't want you on the streets of Britain anymore, get him out. And I'm very clear about that. So we have set out, if you look online, you can see the sorts of factors that militate in favour of one solution or the other. But to be absolutely clear, it will not be appropriate for domestic abuse cases, it will not be appropriate for serious violence, but there are lower level cases where the balance of the public interests favours a more summary solution, which is fair on the taxpayer as well as fair on the police and all the prosecuting authorities.
Thank you. And one of the areas you covered, you touched on a few times in your keynote there, is around international rule of law and the kind of the leading role that the UK plays around the world. Given the current global geopolitical climate, obviously we've got conflicts left, right and centre, what specific steps do you think the UK should take to strengthen our international alliances and to ensure that we're upholding the rule of law throughout?
Great. Well, so the first thing, again, I reckon that there is a poor understanding of, it's not a criticism, amongst all parts of society, is the extent to which we have influence in the world in this. You know, people look to our country very much in this field. I have one small example. I was in Strasbourg recently, which, as you know, ECHR is there, and I went into the chief executive's office, and there was a bust of Churchill there. You know, it was Churchill who, perhaps more than other, was aware of Britain's role in all this. And of course, when I went to the United States and I was talking about William Blackstone, you speak about William Blackstone in England and Wales, most people go completely blank. They hold him up as a giant. You know? And it was William Blackstone who, incidentally, I invoked when we were talking about Horizon, because he said in the 18th century, better that 10 guilty men walk free than one innocent man is made to suffer. I wanted to put as decals on the front of the Ministry of Justice, instead of some tedious corporate speak about, supporting justice, blah, blah, blah. I wanted to talk about some of the sayings that great English and Welsh jurists have come up with. Be you never so high, the law is above you, said Thomas Fuller. What about Section 39, probably wasn't called section, of Magna Carta? No free man should be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, and so on and so on. These are principles that we have given to the world, and we should take great pride in those. And people look to us. And make no mistake, we are in a global contest of ideas. We're in a contest of ideas between those nations who cleave to a rules-based system, which basically says international borders should be observed, and that might is not always right. And that other tradition, if that's the right word, in global politics, which says all that matters is what you can get away with, and international borders don't matter. We have to strengthen that, because if you get to a global anarchic position, this is not, holding on to the rules-based system is not some sort of quaint Magna Carta-esque sort of vision. It's simply because the alternative means chaos, poverty, and distress. And so we have to work to focus on that. And we, as the second largest legal sector in the world, have an extraordinary role to play. And so when we talk about some of the debates in this country, what I think perhaps is less well understood is the extent to which it resonates around the world. And when I was sitting there in Europe, the things that flash up on Europeans' phones are very often what's flashing up on all your phones. They follow what happens in Britain very, very closely. Be under no illusions. We have enormous influence in this sphere, and it's something that's very precious, but it's also something that we have a responsibility for as well.
Thank you. And turning from kind of international cooperation to cooperation and collaboration within government, how do you and your department collaborate with others, such as the Home Office, obviously opposite us here, on some of those issues you raised? I was thinking about substance abuse, thinking about some of the reasons why people might turn to crime, or kind of compounding issues within the criminal system. Things like drug abuse, mental health, domestic violence. How do you work together to try and tackle the underlying causes?
What a great point. So the truth is, the Ministry of Justice is the least important justice department. What I mean by that is, if you want to look at driving down crime, in some ways the things that are most important are, yes, families, how people are brought up is a critically important thing, but it's also issues about what takes place in schools. Because the truth is, there are teachers who every day will look at that 5 or 6 year old and say, hang on a second, I think I've got a problem with this one. And we've got to really address what is going on in that child's life. And my constant refrain has got to be, if I had my dream bill that I'd like to bring in, I'd call it the Go Hard, Go Early bill. In other words, if kids are showing problems, go hard, go early about trying to address what's going on. Because by the time it gets to me, by the time it gets to my department down the line, things have gone very badly wrong. And we are trying, of course, to put away the bad guys who can cause terrible crime and rehabilitate people. I tell you this, I speak as somebody who's defended and stood up and said, please, Your Honour, can you give this guy some drug rehabilitation requirement? Of course we want to do all that, but I always knew that it's much, much harder. If you're trying to rehabilitate someone over the age of 30, it's extremely difficult. Of course we try. We do what Churchill said, there's treasure in the heart of every man. Of course we want to find it. It's much easier to find it in a 15-year-old than it is in a 35-year-old. So that's point one. To your specific issue, that's why we also have to work with other departments. My ability to help those guys who are going to have a substance abuse issue, which we'd love to cure, but the truth is very often it's about managing. I can only do that by the help of NHS. So they have put in £500,000. So we've got these health and justice partners. We've got over 55 recruited, and they come, as it were, into prison and help people migrate from prison into the community. Or what about working with the Home Office, where, for example, our ability to create a new offence of spiking, which you'll have seen in the press, that's from working very closely with James Cleverly, my counterpart. So it is absolutely essential, that partnership working. We have a really good, grown-up, sensible, collaborative agreement, and it's just a joy working with James Cleverly. But I just want to end where I began. If we are serious about driving things down and continuing the, I think, genuinely exceptional progress we've made, other government departments must recognise that in some ways they're more important than mine when it comes to tackling crime.
Sure. Conscious of time, we'll turn to some questions from the audience now, so please wait for the microphone to come to you. Again, because of the timing, if you can keep questions short and concise, that'd be really appreciated. We'll start with the lady in the turquoise top of the back.
Thank you. My name is Gemma Abbott. I'm the legal director at the Howard League for Penal Reform.
Yes.
So very interested in all you had to say about prisons in particular. Yeah. And obviously delighted to hear about the focus on rehabilitation. as one of the sort of purposes of sentencing. But I do think there's a sort of elephant in the room here. We've touched on overcrowding a bit, but when you have men in particular locked in their cells for 23 hours a day, the idea that they're going to be rehabilitated in that environment is just, it's for the birds. And you talked about the turnaround at HMP Liverpool, which I think is such an important example. But there, to do that, you know, the governor then was on record, you took out 500 men and invested £25 million. But we don't see that at Bedford, where you're 150% overcrowded at the moment, and there's no sense of men being left there because there's nowhere else to put them. So I just wonder how you can marry up this drive for being tougher on crime, which only leads to further overcrowding, at the same time as the focus on rehabilitation, which is so important and I really value. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Really important points. So the first thing is, as I said about crowding levels, and by the way, what crowding means in simple terms is 2 people in the cell, right? So that's broadly what that means. It's about the same level now than it was in 2010. It's a little bit more, but it's in the same sort of ballpark. But you make one really important point, okay? Look, you can be tough on crime, and we say we are tough on crime, but you have to stop and think and pause if you're going into a cell and speaking to someone, as I did at Wandsworth, to find out they've been locked up for 23 hours a day. I agree with you about that, right? That's not right. It's not right. And so, I mean, I remember speaking to some guy who was on remand. He's not even convicted of anything, and he'd been 23 hours. Now, that was particularly during the fag end of COVID, where, hang on, let me come back to you in a moment, where regimes were unlocking, but they'd been very tight. Now, the first thing it's really important to note, just about the pandemic experience, and I'll come to what's happened subsequently, is the predictions during COVID was that thousands and thousands and thousands of people would die, prisoners would die. Now, in the event, the figure was less than 200. Every single one is a tragedy, and of course, my heart goes out to them, their friends and their families. I totally get all that. But the prison system broadly kept those folks safe. Now, that's an important point, and part of it was there was a cost to that, because keeping people locked up had particular harm, particularly in the women's estate, by the way, and so I totally get that. But to your point about Liverpool, what I think you, respectfully, the other part of context that it's worth putting in, is that when I went there, the specific question that I asked the governor as we were on the landing, I said, well, tell me about the regime. And he said, as a result of the investment that's gone in, not only are we bringing back on those 300 places, it was actually 300, not 500, but you know, let's split the difference, doesn't matter, whatever, anyway, bringing on those 300 places. And I said, what is the average amount of time that people are out? And it's 7 hours. And I was speaking to guys working in the laundry, and they were talking about how the regime gives them a sense of preparing for the working day. I was speaking to guys who were repairing bicycles to get, learning some skills to get on the outside. Now, there are parts of the estate where I completely accept the regimes are not where I'd want them to be. I can tell you, I am passionately determined to try to improve it. How are we actually getting that better? More staffing. So the most fabulous statistic, I think, up to, now hang on, if I'm going to get this right, September, the end of September last year, we recruited an additional 1,400 prison officers. The attrition rate, so the resignation rate, is right down, is coming down significantly. That is what's going to allow us to increase the size of the regime. So we're investing money in prisons, biggest rollout since the Victorian era, investing money in prison officers, and we are determined to have a positive regime, because that's how you rehabilitate prisons.
Thanks, Alex. Take our second question from the gentleman just in front of the pillar there.
Thank you. Sorry, my voice going. George Grant from Tempus Novo.
From what?
Tempus Novo.
Right.
My question to you is, a lot of what you've brought in has been objectively, I think, very positive, the reforms that you're making. You were relatively robust in your critique of your Labour opposition. If I may put to you, as a Conservative Chancellor, the unthinkable prospect that you don't win another term in office, those reforms that you genuinely believe, these need to carry forward, what work are you doing with your opposition numbers to actually say, look, take the politics out of this, these things need to carry on beyond the next election? Maybe you can't even say, but or is that work going on somewhere behind the scenes to make sure that those things that you really, that they're carried through and that they're not dropped or left by the wayside because people don't actually realise?
Do you know what? Look, I I came into politics because I wanted to do stuff, because I care passionate about this country and I wanted to make things better. And frankly, I'll work with anyone who's going to help me to do that. I don't approach it saying, well, there's sort of people I can't have a conversation with, and I do have a sensible conversation. But I'm not saying this for political effect. I genuinely don't know what they want to do. There's no. It's one thing not having a plan, and we hear a lot about that, but there's no principle either. So to give you an example, so we're talking about the stuff on short sentences because I think the world has changed since 2010. We can do stuff now with technology, which means you can get much better compliance, you can get much, whatever. So there's a very good argument for it. They, on the one hand, will say, oh yeah, we think this is quite sensible, and then in the chamber, they'll try to attack it for political reasons. So I just don't know which side they're on. I don't know whether they're tough on crime, and yet they pop up and say, well, we want to get rid of joint enterprise liability, so which is it? They say that actually we believe in getting rid of foreign national offenders, and then literally wrote to me campaigning to stop a plane load of rapists and GBHs taking off from the tarmac. And they literally wrote to try to stop that plane taking off. So look, I've had sensible discussions with my opposite number, and I will continue to do so. And I, of course, hope that if I'm able to bring forward reforms, that they will continue. But without wanting to say this for political effect, I literally have no idea what their plan is to address some of these fundamental problems. And my job, I think, as a Secretary of State, is to be as candid as I properly can about the issues that we face. And I accept that as a result of those two decisions of principle, which I would take again, by the way, this does mean that there are challenges. We've got a proposal for how we should grind that through, how we should heal the system, but I'm afraid there's just a lot of politics. And I accept in an election you're going to get a bit of that, but I would hope for a bit of substance, but substance has come there, none.
I can take a question from this side of the room as well. Gentleman in the glasses in this second row to the back there.
Thanks. John Collins from the Prisoners Education Trust. You talked about the importance of employment for people leaving prison, but we know people coming into prison have poor levels of literacy, numeracy and functional skills. Yet HMIP and Ofsted have been very critical of access to and quality of education. So I guess my question is, how do you make education more of a priority, and how do you improve the quality of what's available?
Spot on, right? So I've been, there's lots of ideas I have about this, but bluntly where I would like to get to is you have kind of like education screening on the way in and then education screening on the way out, but how do you motivate people to do that? But just assume for a second you can do it. And then you've got to find a way of measuring and holding people to account, whether it's governors and others, for how they've got on during that time. In other words, that so long as you don't want the education service to be performative. Well, do you know what, we've done our bit, we've given these guys some materials, whether he looks at them or not, it's one of those things. But at least we've done it. There's got to be more rigor, I think. Now, this is my point about us being a downstream department. The truth is it's really, really hard to improve literacy levels. That's why it's much better to get these kids early and so on. But that having been said, we've got to try. You've got to try hard to do it. So I think ultimately people respond well to incentives and accountability. And I think we need to improve the accountability. Because apart from anything else, that then, if a governor knows that he or she is going to be held to account for the fact that the exit scores are really not where we need them to be, then that, I think, causes them to focus on the provider, be it Tempest Nova, whoever it is, say, do you know what, these materials are a bit shonky, I think we could do better on this, and holds them to account. The amounts of money, by the way, we're putting into this are vast. I'll be corrected by my advisor, but I think it's over £150 million a year. It's a lot of money goes into this stuff. And I think that we want to roll out the whole prisoner education system, but core to it has got to be measurement and accountability.
Thank you. And final question I'll take from Penelope there in the third row.
Penelope Gibbs from Transform Justice. If you speak to people who've been in the criminal justice system, whether prison or not, and all those who work with them, they say one of the biggest game changers would be to reform our criminal records checks. Not to abolish them altogether, but to make less very old and minor crimes appear on those records. What do you think about that?
Well, look, this is something, the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974 has been considered at length. The Justice Select Committee, which I sat on, looked at precisely this issue. We took a lot of powerful evidence from people who said, at age 15, I did something stupid, and now this is having a long-term impact. And a number of changes have been made to ensure that there's a proper balance. So what we don't have is a system in this country of sealing people's criminal records, effectively wiping them all together. And indeed, I don't think your proposing that. But what we did do was ensure that there were reforms to the spent conviction period. I think we need to keep this constantly under review. I don't sit there and say, I think the balance is better. Is the balance perfect? I wouldn't necessarily say that. What I can say is we've moved quite a long way. Personally, I would not be comfortable about a situation where records were wiped completely, and that's because there will be occasions where you need to do develop vetting, or you need to really go much further in particularly sensitive jobs, whether it's working with children or working in a national security environment, where someone's conviction for GBH, even if it was when they were an idiot age 16, is something that you need to know about. But I'm always open for a conversation about whether we've got the balance right. I do think, however, that we're in a much better position than we used to be, and that's because of the reforms that we've taken. Okay.
Thanks, Alex. Before we conclude, just a few quick thanks from me. First, to all of you who joined us here today, thank you for coming along. I do hope we'll see you again at another Conservative Home event in the future. To everyone watching along on the live stream, to our partners, Australia Lens Skills and Carlisle Support Services, to the Conservative Home event team for making this all possible, so Sarah and Abigail, who you will have all seen, to all of our panellists. And finally, Alex, thank you so much for giving of your time. You remain a feature in the top 5 of the Conservative Home Cabinet League table, and hopefully your appearance today will propel you further up. So thank you very much. Thank you.